It was a stormy night, and the rain had been pouring down in sheets for hours, blurring the road ahead. Emily was driving home after visiting her parents in the next town over, her windshield wipers frantically clearing the water, but it never seemed enough. The road was slick, the kind of slippery where every turn felt like a gamble. Her headlights cut through the darkness, only illuminating the stretch of road right in front of her, and beyond that, it was a black abyss. The wind howled against her car, making the trees sway violently on either side of the road. The air was thick with tension. Emily's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white from anxiety, but she pushed through, knowing she would feel better once she reached the safety of home. As she drove on, her thoughts drifted. She'd heard the rumors about this stretch of road. People talked about strange occurrences, sightings of figures along the side of the road, ghostly shadows flickering in the corner of your eye. But Emily wasn't one to believe in those things. She was practical, logical, but tonight something felt different. There was an eerie stillness that hung in the air, a sense of being watched. She told herself it was just the storm, that the dark and wind played tricks on her mind. Then it happened. A figure appeared out of nowhere on the side of the road. It was just a blur at first, but as Emily got closer, she could make out the shape of a person. A woman, drenched from the rain, standing still in the middle of nowhere. She was staring at the ground, her hair matted and dark from the downpour. Her clothes were ragged, torn as if she'd been out there for days. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with questions. Why was this woman here alone at this hour? Instinctively, Emily slowed down, her headlights casting a harsh glow over the woman. But as the car got closer, the woman didn't move. It was as if she hadn't noticed the approaching vehicle at all. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach, an unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. Should she stop? Should she offer help? But something about the scene felt wrong. The woman's stillness, the dark, empty road, it didn't sit right with her. Emily's foot hovered over the brake, unsure, but something made her press on, urging her to drive past. As she passed the figure, she stole a glance in the rearview mirror. What she saw made her blood run cold. The woman had not moved from where she stood, but now she was looking directly at the car. Her eyes, empty, dark holes, stared at Emily with an unnatural intensity, sending a chill through her body. Then the woman raised a hand. Slowly, almost deliberately, she pointed toward Emily's car with a finger that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She slammed her foot on the gas, the car accelerating, the roar of the engine drowning out the sound of the rain. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't shake the image of that hand reaching toward her. The road twisted ahead, the dense trees growing closer, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. She kept her eyes fixed on the road, not daring to glance in the rearview mirror again. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. Was she being followed? Every time she looked, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, the rain louder, as though the storm itself was closing in around her. Emily felt a strange pressure in her chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Her grip tightened on the wheel, but her vision began to blur. She wiped her eyes, trying to clear the mist, but the world around her had taken on an almost surreal quality. Nothing seemed real anymore. The rain fell heavier, blurring everything in a thick, watery haze. A sudden crack of thunder shook her to the core. Her car swerved sharply, and she barely regained control. She could feel the tires skidding on the wet pavement, slipping dangerously close to the edge of the road. Panic set in, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the thought of that woman's eyes, the way they seemed to pierce right through her. Emily's hands trembled as she fought to keep the car steady. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, once, twice, then went out entirely. The darkness enveloped her, the only sound the torrential downpour beating against the roof. In that moment of total blackness, Emily's heart stopped. There was nothing. No road, no lights, no nothing. She was completely blind. In a frantic panic, she tried to restart the car, her hands fumbling for the ignition. But the engine sputtered, stalling again and again. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the deafening sound of the rain, and then a whisper, barely audible over the storm. It seemed to come from all around her, not from a single point, but from every direction. "Help me." Emily froze. Her skin crawled with the sound, a voice that seemed so real, so close. She wanted to scream, to drive away, but her body wouldn't respond. She felt trapped, unable to escape the sound, the overwhelming sensation that something was pressing in on her from all sides. And then the car's headlights flared back to life. For a split second, the world outside was clear, until she saw it. The woman. She was standing right in front of the car now, her face pressed against the windshield, her hands flat against the glass, her eyes wide open, staring directly at Emily. The rain streaked down the glass, but those eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, didn't blink, didn't move. The air inside the car grew thick, suffocating, as Emily's breath quickened in panic. The woman's mouth opened, and she whispered once more, louder this time. "Help me!" Emily screamed, tearing at the door handle, desperate to get out, but the car doors wouldn't budge. The woman's hand scraped against the window, leaving behind a trail of something dark, something that didn't belong there. And then, as quickly as she appeared, the woman vanished, as if the storm had swallowed her whole. The headlights flickered one last time before going out again, plunging Emily back into the suffocating darkness. She had no idea how much time had passed when the lights finally came back on, but the woman was gone. The road stretched out before her, silent and empty. Emily didn't stop driving until she reached home, where she locked all the doors and sat trembling in the silence. The rain still hammered against the roof, but now it felt like a distant echo, like something far removed from the horror she had just witnessed. She tried to convince herself it was just the stress of the storm, the fatigue from the long drive, but deep down, she knew better. The woman had been real, and she wasn't alone on that road.
Story number 2.
It was late, far past midnight, when David found himself driving through a desolate stretch of highway. He had just finished an exhausting business trip and was on his way home, but the weather was making it difficult. The rain poured down in sheets, and the wind howled fiercely, rattling the trees on the sides of the road. The headlights of his car cut through the thick mist that seemed to crawl over the asphalt. Everything felt wrong, the kind of wrong that gnawed at the edges of your senses, but you couldn't explain. As he continued driving, David's thoughts wandered. The radio crackled with static, and he reached out to turn it off, but before his fingers could find the button, a song played. A slow, eerie melody that made his skin prickle. He frowned, wondering where the song had come from. He hadn't tuned the station in hours, and it was the kind of tune he hadn't heard in years. Old, familiar, but unsettling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized it was a song his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. But there was something wrong about the voice. It sounded distant, almost ghostly, like a recording from another time, but he could hear his mother's voice clear as day. How could that be? She passed away years ago. Panic surged within him, and he jerked his hand away from the radio, shutting it off. But the atmosphere in the car had changed. The air was thick, and his heart beat faster. Something was wrong with the road. He couldn't quite place it, but the world outside his car seemed more oppressive, as though the storm had distorted everything. The rain seemed to fall in an unnatural rhythm, like it was following him, tapping against his windshield in a way that sounded almost like whispers. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. He nearly drove past it, but something made him slow down. The figure was a man, dressed in a tattered coat, soaked to the bone, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He was motionless, standing still in the storm, with his back turned to the road. David's gut twisted with unease. He didn't want to stop. He had heard stories of people stranded on the road, only to pull over and end up victims of some horrible fate. But there was something about the figure that seemed oddly familiar, almost like a shadow from his past. Against his better judgment, he pulled over, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. David hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car. The wind stung his skin and the rain pummeled his face. The man didn't budge. "Hey, are you all right?" David called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. There was no answer. David stepped closer, his heart racing in his chest. As he neared the figure, the man suddenly turned, slowly, as if it was taking every ounce of energy he had to do so. David froze when he saw the man's face. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and his eyes, David couldn't bear to look at them. They were hollow, sunken, like dark pits where nothing remained. His lips cracked into a twisted smile. "You're too late," the man whispered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far beneath the earth, distant and gravelly. "She's already waiting." David stumbled backward, his mind spinning, but before he could react, the figure reached out with long, bony fingers. The coldness in the air deepened, and a wave of nausea hit him like a punch to the stomach. His feet felt as though they were glued to the ground, as though the earth itself had grasped hold of him. The man's hand closed in on David's wrist, the touch freezing, unnatural. David screamed, tearing himself free, and ran back to his car. His hands were shaking as he yanked open the door, barely managing to get inside. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned the key in the ignition, desperate to leave, but the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. The figure was standing at the edge of his headlights now, staring at him. Its face, no, the face was David's. Or at least it looked like him, twisted and unrecognizable, the same hollow eyes staring back. The realization hit him like a cold slap to the face. The man wasn't just a stranger. It was a reflection of himself, a version of him he had never seen before, staring at him from a dark place he didn't understand. Suddenly, the car door opened by itself, the wind howling in, and a low voice whispered from the back seat, a voice that sounded like his mother's, yet empty and far too distant. "Come with me, David. It's time." David screamed and floored the gas pedal, the car roaring to life. He didn't dare look back. His grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. The road ahead was a blur, the rain slashing against the windshield in chaotic patterns. But no matter how fast he drove, the sensation of being followed never left. In the rearview mirror, just out of sight, he swore he could see the shadow of the man in the back seat, inching closer with each passing second. His home was still miles away, but it felt as though the storm was pushing him into something much darker than the night itself. The whispers grew louder, filling the car. "She's waiting. You're too late." David didn't stop until he reached his driveway, nearly crashing the car in his haste. When he slammed the car into park and leapt out, he ran toward his front door, hands shaking, heart hammering in his chest. But when he stepped inside, the house was empty. Everything was silent. He froze, breath catching in his throat. On the kitchen table lay a single picture face down. His hand trembling, he turned it over. It was a photo of him, at a younger age, standing next to a woman, his mother. Her eyes were hollow and black. Underneath, in messy, frantic handwriting, it read, "You should have listened to the warning. Now she's with you, forever." David stumbled back, his breath shallow and frantic. The whispers from the back of his mind became a loud, insistent voice, repeating over and over, louder and louder. "You're too late." In the reflection of the window, he saw her standing behind him, his mother, her face twisted into a grotesque grin, her hollow eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. David knew then. He had driven straight into a trap, and now there was no escape.
Story number 3.
It was a dark, rainy night when Sarah set off on the long drive back home after visiting her sister. She had planned on leaving earlier, but after a late dinner and some catching up, she found herself on the road just as the rain began to fall heavily. The highway was eerily quiet, save for the sound of her tires splashing through puddles and the soft hum of the engine. The windshield wipers moved relentlessly back and forth, but they barely managed to keep up with the downpour. The road was familiar, winding through thick woods and small sleepy towns. Sarah had driven it many times before, but tonight felt different. The storm had a weight to it, the kind that made her feel like she was being watched. A strange chill crept over her as she glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. The only other cars on the road seemed to be driving in the opposite direction, their headlights briefly illuminating the darkness before disappearing. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel as the trees lining the road seemed to loom closer, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt. It felt as though the storm was closing in around her, suffocating her. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at her. As Sarah rounded a sharp bend in the road, she noticed something strange ahead. A figure. A man standing at the side of the highway in the pouring rain. His clothes were soaked, his arms limp by his sides. He wasn't moving at all. She instinctively slowed down, her heart racing. Who would be out here in the middle of the night in this storm? She considered stopping, maybe offering a ride, but something in her gut told her not to. It was an unexplainable instinct, one that she couldn't ignore. As she passed the figure, she took a quick glance at him. The man's face was obscured by the shadows, but she thought she saw something wrong. His head was tilted unnaturally to one side, as if his neck was broken, and his eyes were wide open, glazed and staring directly at her car. A shiver ran down her spine. She pushed her foot on the gas pedal, eager to put more distance between herself and the strange man. But just as she thought she had passed the spot, her rearview mirror caught her eye. The man was no longer standing at the side of the road. He was in the middle of the highway, directly behind her, walking slowly after the car. Her heart skipped a beat. He couldn't have caught up so fast. It didn't make sense. Sarah's hands gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She accelerated, the sound of the engine roaring in her ears, but the man didn't stop. He just kept walking behind her car, his pace never increasing, never slowing down. His face was still obscured by the rain, but she knew he was there, following her. Her breath quickened. What should she do? Should she pull over? Should she keep driving? But there was something off about this. The way he moved, the way he never seemed to tire. Sarah tried to focus on the road, her mind racing with fear. She needed to get home. She needed to get away. But no matter how fast she drove, the man stayed right behind her, always just out of the corner of her eye. Minutes passed, she wasn't sure how many, and then the car's headlights flickered. Once, twice, and then the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a slow stop on the side of the road. Panic set in. She frantically tried to restart the engine, her hands shaking as she twisted the key, but it wouldn't turn. The car was dead. The man was closer now, his shadow just at the edge of her rearview mirror, closer than before. Sarah's eyes filled with terror. He was almost directly behind her, too close for comfort. He hadn't made a sound, not a footstep, not a breath. He was just there, silent, watching. The air grew cold, too cold, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. Her skin prickled with dread. She slowly turned her head, peering through the back window, expecting to standing just a few feet away. But there was nothing, no one. Her breath hitched. The man wasn't there anymore. Suddenly, there was a knock on the driver's side window. Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she whipped her head around to find herself face to face with the figure, the man from the road. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide open and completely blank. No pupils, no expression, just a void where his eyes should have been. The man's mouth moved, but there was no sound. The wetness from the rain was dripping down his face, mixing with something darker, something far more sinister. A low whisper finally reached her ears. "Let me in." Sarah screamed, throwing the car door open and stumbling out, not even thinking to look back as she bolted into the woods, her footsteps heavy against the soaked earth. The storm had worsened, the rain now a torrential downpour, but she didn't care. She ran. It wasn't until she reached a small, distant house that she stopped, breathless and trembling. She banged on the door, crying for help. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman stepped out, her face filled with concern. "What happened? Are you all right?" she asked. Through her ragged breath, Sarah managed to get the words out. "There's a man on the road. He's following me." The woman's expression didn't change. She stepped back and gestured for Sarah to come inside. "Quickly," she urged. "I know." Sarah hesitated for a moment, confusion clouding her mind. "You know?" The woman nodded, her face grim. "We've all seen him, every one of us who's driven this road at night. He's always there, but he's not real." "What do you mean?" Sarah whispered, still shaken to the core. "He's a ghost," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He's been following people for years, every single one of them. You won't be the last." Suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared in the distance, echoing through the woods. The woman's eyes went wide, and she grabbed Sarah by the arm. "You have to leave," she whispered urgently. "You can't stay here. He's coming for you." As Sarah turned to leave, She heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she didn't dare look back. She had no idea if the man had followed her, if he had found her, or if he was just a ghost, a presence that would haunt her forever. But one thing was certain: she would never drive that road again.